Could a wedding, intended to suture the gaping wounds of a kingdom, become the very blade that dealt its mortal blow? In the simmering heat of August 1572, Paris was a city holding its breath. It was a masterpiece of gilded tension, a powder keg draped in silks and velvets. The marriage of Marguerite de Valois, the Catholic sister of the king, to Henry of Navarre, the charismatic leader of the Protestant Huguenots, was presented as a triumph of reason over faith, a political masterstroke to end decades of savage religious warfare. Yet for a city that was the beating, fanatical heart of French Catholicism, this union was not a peace treaty, it was a profanation. Into this cauldron of piety and paranoia marched thousands of Huguenot nobles, confident, armed, and celebrating their prince's ascent. They were the wolves invited to a feast in the lion's den, and they failed to notice the cage door swinging shut behind them. What historical anomaly allowed such seasoned, battle-hardened soldiers, men who had survived countless ambushes and sieges, to believe they were safe in a city whose very cobblestones cried out for their blood? The air, thick with the scent of summer sweat and roasting meat, was also heavy with the poison of whispered sermons. In the dark, cavernous churches, priests painted the Huguenots not as dissenting Christians, but as demonic polluters of the sacred soil of France, their very presence an invitation to God's wrath. The architect of this fragile peace, the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, moved through the halls of the Louvre like a spider spinning an invisible web. Was she a peacemaker or the ultimate conspirator? Her motives remain one of history's most tantalizing political mysteries, locked behind a death mask of regal ambiguity. She had spent a lifetime balancing the warring factions of her kingdom, playing the ultra-Catholic Guise family against the Protestant Bourbons, all to protect the fragile authority of her sons. Now she smiled at the Huguenot admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the moral leader of the cause, while perhaps calculating the precise angle of a sniper's shot. The court was a performance of breathtaking hypocrisy. Days were filled with lavish tournaments, opulent balls, and extravagant masks, where Catholic and Protestant lords danced together, their hands clasped in feigned friendship, while their minds harbored thoughts of murder. The nights, however, were for secrets. In clandestine meetings deep within the palace, strategies were debated, loyalties were tested, and gold, rivers of it, rumoured to be from the coffers of the Spanish king Philip II, flowed into the hands of mercenaries and city militia captains. In the shadowy back alleys of the Les Halles market, the grinding of sharpening stones became the city's nocturnal anthem. Steel was being honed, not for a foreign war, but for a war against neighbours. The common Parisian lived in a state of agitated fear and righteous fury. They had suffered through years of conflict, their trade disrupted, their faith mocked by the very existence of the Huguenots, whom they saw as arrogant heretics protected by powerful nobles. They watched the Protestant lords swagger through their streets, their sober black doublets a stark rebuke to Catholic finery, and they seethed. The wedding festivities were to them an insult to God. The lavish spending, the mingling of the pure with the impure, felt like a prelude to divine punishment. Preachers, like human blowtorches, fanned the flames of this resentment from their pulpits, promising salvation to those who would help purge the city of this contamination. They spoke of omens, of a hawthorn bush in the cemetery of the innocents that had bloomed out of season, a sign, they claimed, that God approved of the cleansing to come. It was a city on the verge of a psychotic break, where collective paranoia was mistaken for religious zeal. The Huguenots, for their part, were not entirely naive. They kept their swords close and travelled in groups, their military instincts dulled but not erased by the champagne and celebrations. They trusted their leader, Henry of Navarre, and their elder statesman, Admiral Coligny, who had received personal assurances of safety from the king himself. What could possibly go wrong? It's a question that hangs over so many of history's great disasters. King Charles IX, a young, nervous, and profoundly unstable monarch, was a whirlwind of contradictions. He seemed genuinely fond of Admiral Coligny, calling him "my father," and listening intently to his plans for a unified French war against Catholic Spain in the Netherlands. This was Catherine de' Medici's greatest fear. A war with Spain would be a catastrophe for France and would elevate Coligny, a Protestant, to a position of unrivaled power, eclipsing her own. She saw her life's work of preserving the Valois dynasty from the ambitions of powerful nobles about to be undone by her own son's admiration for a heretic. The pressure was immense. The Guise family, led by the charismatic and vengeably handsome Henry, Duc de Guise, demanded justice for his father, Francis, assassinated years earlier, an act they blamed on Coligny. The Spanish ambassador whispered threats of war. The Parisian mob grew more restless by the day. The wedding was not a solution, it was an ultimatum. Something had to break. And so the machinery of the plot began to turn, its gears greased with fear, ambition, and fanaticism. The contrast was cinematic. Inside the Louvre, musicians played, and poets recited verses celebrating love and unity. The bride, Marguerite, beautiful and intellectually brilliant, was said to be miserable, a pawn in a game she despised. Her new husband, Henry of Navarre, moved with an easy charm, gambling, laughing, and seducing court ladies, seemingly oblivious to the danger. He was a survivor, playing the part of the rustic, pleasure-loving prince, a mask that would save his life. Outside the palace walls, the atmosphere was thick with menace. The city militia, the bourgeois guard of Paris, was quietly mobilized. Lists of known Huguenot residences were drawn up and distributed. Captains were given their secret orders. The plan was not yet for a general massacre, or so the later justifications would claim. It was for a targeted assassination, a surgical strike to remove the head of the Huguenot snake, Admiral Coligny. They believed his death would decapitate the Protestant leadership, leaving them confused and willing to flee Paris. It was a fatal miscalculation. They underestimated the fury of the beast they were about to wound. They failed to understand that in a city primed for slaughter, a single drop of blood could unleash a flood. The final feast was held, the last toast was made. The Huguenot nobles, flushed with wine and self-assurance, retired to their beds in the Louvre and in rented mansions across the city, never dreaming that the laws of hospitality, sacred since the dawn of civilization, were about to be systematically and brutally annulled. In Paris that night, the sleep of the innocent was the most dangerous indulgence of all. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the crimson curtain was about to rise on a tragedy that would forever stain the soul of a nation. All that was needed was a single, defining act of violence to begin the play. The focus of this intricate web of conspiracy, the man whose life or death held the fate of thousands in the balance, was the aging Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. This grand wedding was presented as a bridge between two faiths, a promise of a new era. But looking into the cold, calculating eyes of its architect, Catherine de' Medici, what do you see? A desperate politician making a final gamble for peace, or a master manipulator setting the perfect trap? Let us know what you believe in the comments below. The aging Admiral, Gaspard de Coligny, was the living embodiment of the Huguenot cause. He was a man of stern principles, unwavering faith, and immense military prestige. He was the one leader who commanded the respect of all the Protestant factions, the rock upon which their church was built. And on the morning of Friday, the 22nd of August, just 4 days after the wedding, that rock was struck. As Coligny walked back from a meeting at the Louvre, reading a letter, a shot rang out from an upstairs window of a house belonging to a known retainer of the de Guise family. The assassin's arquebus ball tore through his hand and lodged in his left arm. He was wounded, bleeding profusely, but alive. The would-be killer, a professional bravo named Maurevel, known as the King's Killer, made a clean escape on a horse that had been conveniently waiting for him in the cloister behind the house. Paris, which had been simmering for days, instantly boiled over. The attack was an act of war in a time of supposed peace, a brazen assault on a guest of the king who was under his personal protection. Within minutes, hundreds of enraged Huguenot gentlemen, their hands on their sword hilts, had gathered at the scene, their cries for justice echoing through the narrow streets. They carried their wounded leader back to his lodgings at the Hôtel de Béthissy, their faces a mixture of shock and incandescent fury. The shot turned a political crisis into a detective story, a thriller where every powerful figure in Paris was a potential suspect. Who had armed the hand of Maurevert? The most obvious culprit was the Duc de Guise, seeking personal vengeance for his father's death. He had the motive and the means, and the house from which the shot was fired was linked to his family. But was he merely a pawn? Many Huguenots pointed the finger higher, at the king's brother, the Duke of Anjou, the future Henry III, a fervent Catholic with a deep personal dislike for Coligny. Others whispered of Philip II of Spain, who had every reason to eliminate the man who was pushing France towards a war against his empire in the Netherlands. And then there was Catherine de' Medici herself. Had her plan for a war with Spain been a feint all along? Had she approved the hit to eliminate Coligny, regain control over her son, and placate the Catholic faction, believing a single, swift murder could rebalance the kingdom? The possibilities swirled like smoke, obscuring the truth in a haze of accusation and counter-accusation. The one thing that was certain was that the failed assassination was infinitely more dangerous than a successful one would have been. A dead Coligny would have left the Huguenots leaderless and stunned. A wounded Coligny left them furious, united and demanding a reckoning. King Charles IX's reaction was a storm of royal fury. He visited the wounded admiral's bedside, a rare honor, and swore a solemn oath. "My father," he said, tears of rage in his eyes, "the wound is yours, but the pain is mine. I swear to God I will find the perpetrators, and I will make them pay with a punishment so terrible that it will never be forgotten." For a brief moment it seemed the king would stand by his word. He ordered an immediate investigation. The gates of Paris were shut to prevent the assassin from escaping. The house used by the shooter was searched. The evidence trail led, unsurprisingly, directly toward the de Guise faction. The Huguenot leaders gathered around Coligny's bed were not satisfied with promises. They spoke openly of taking justice into their own hands, of leaving Paris and reigniting the civil war. Some of the more hot-headed nobles threatened the Duc de Guise to his face in the halls of the Louvre. The palace, which had so recently been a scene of celebration, now crackled with the energy of imminent violence. The king was trapped. To prosecute the Guises, the champions of Catholic France, would risk an uprising in Paris. To do nothing would confirm the Huguenots' worst fears of royal treachery and guarantee a new war. He was a weak king caught between two speeding carriages, and a collision was now unavoidable. The center of the storm was the Tuileries Palace, where Catherine de' Medici held a series of frantic, secret councils. The atmosphere was one of pure panic. Her gamble had failed spectacularly. The plan to eliminate Coligny had not only been unsuccessful, but it had also cornered the monarchy. Reports flooded in from her spies. The Huguenots were arming themselves. They were plotting to abduct the king for his own safety. They were planning to execute the Duc de Guise. These reports were likely exaggerated, perhaps deliberately so by those who wanted to force the king's hand, but in the climate of fear, they were believed. It was in one of these nocturnal meetings, held on the evening of the 23rd of August, that the nature of the plot underwent a monstrous transformation. The idea of a legal investigation was abandoned. The conversation shifted from justice to survival, and from survival to extermination. If the Huguenots were indeed planning a preemptive strike, as Catherine and her allies now claimed to believe, then the only option was a strike that was even more preemptive, more brutal, and more final. In the Palace of Kings, the deadliest poison is not arsenic, but fear whispered in a royal ear. And that night, the king's counselors poured it into him in lethal doses. They argued that the crown was in peril, that the state itself was on the brink of collapse. They told Charles that his authority was a sham, that the Huguenots saw his tears at Coligny's bedside as a sign of weakness. His mother, his brother, his most trusted advisors, they all spoke with one voice. Kill them all, not the common Huguenots, not yet, just the leaders, a few dozen men, a swift, silent operation in the dead of night, a surgical coup to save the kingdom. It would be presented to the world as the regrettable but necessary quelling of a Protestant plot against the royal family. Charles resisted. He raged, he sweated, he swore. He had given Coligny his word, but he was a fragile man, prone to violent mood swings and easily dominated by his formidable mother. The pressure mounted hour by hour. Finally, in a fit of hysterical rage, he broke. "By God's death!" he reputedly screamed. "Since you want to kill the admiral, then kill him, but you must also kill all the Huguenots in France, so that not one is left to reproach me. Kill them all. Give the order now." With that single, terrible outburst, a limited political assassination was greenlit to become a massacre. The Rubicon had been crossed. The order was given. The captains of the Paris militia and the Duc de Guise were summoned. The plan was laid out with chilling military precision. The signal for the operation to commence was to be the tolling of the great bell of the church adjacent to the Louvre, the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. It was to be rung early, before dawn, on the feast day of St. Bartholomew. In the pre-dawn darkness, the bell waited in its tower, a bronze tongue ready to speak a language of death over a city that was about to become an abattoir. The church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois stood silent in the deep, suffocating darkness of a Parisian summer night. For centuries, its bells had marked the rhythms of life in the city. The call to prayer, the celebration of weddings, the mourning of funerals. But on this night, the night of Saturday, the 23rd of August, into the early hours of Sunday, the 24th, its purpose was inverted. It was not to celebrate a saint's day, but to signal the damnation of thousands. Inside the church, the bell ringers waited for the command. Across the city, men were stirring. The Duc de Guise and his retinue were arming themselves in his mansion. The city militia captains were rousing their men, distributing white crosses to be worn on their hats and white scarves for their arms, simple field signs to distinguish killer from victim in the chaos to come. In the Louvre itself, the palace guards were given their gruesome instructions. The Huguenot nobles sleeping in the palace, guests of the king, were to be systematically butchered. The air was still and heavy, pregnant with a violence that was about to be born. Then, sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, much earlier than planned, the order was given. The great bell of Saint-Germain began to toll, a slow, deep, resonant peal that rolled out over the sleeping rooftops. It was a sound that was meant to be a signal, but it became a death knell. The first target was the source of the crisis, Admiral Coligny. The Duc de Guise, along with the king's illegitimate half-brother, the bastard of Angoulême, and a company of soldiers, rode to the admiral's lodgings. They smashed down the door. Coligny, who had been woken by the noise, was with his pastor, Merlin, calmly preparing himself for death. When the assassins, led by a mercenary named Besme, burst into his room, the admiral faced them with quiet dignity. "Young man," he said to Besme, "you ought to respect my grey hairs. But do what you will. You can only shorten my life by a little." Besme stared at him for a moment, then plunged his sword into the old man's chest. Others followed, stabbing the lifeless body again and again. In the courtyard below, Henry de Guise was growing impatient. "Are you finished?" he shouted up. "Finished," came the reply, "and then throw him down." The assassins lifted the admiral's body and heaved it through the window. It landed with a sickening thud at the feet of the Duc de Guise. He dismounted, wiped the blood from the admiral's face with his handkerchief to be certain it was him, and, according to some accounts, kicked the corpse in contempt. The head of the Huguenot cause was dead. The first act of the tragedy was complete. His body would later be mutilated, dragged through the streets, and hung by its feet from the public gibbet at Montfaucon. Simultaneously, the second phase of the operation began within the walls of the Louvre. The palace, a symbol of royal protection and the sacred laws of hospitality, became a slaughterhouse. The list of Huguenot nobles staying as guests was, in effect, a death list. Swiss mercenaries and palace guards went from room to room. The sleeping, unarmed men were dragged from their beds and cut down in the corridors. Some fought back desperately, using furniture as makeshift weapons. Others, realizing the futility, died with prayers on their lips. The Comte de la Rochefoucauld, a close friend of the king who had been joking and wrestling with him just hours before, was awakened by men at his door claiming to be the king, there for another prank. He opened it and was immediately stabbed to death. The sounds of the killing, the clash of steel, the splintering of doors, the screams of the dying echoed through the gilded halls. That night, the Louvre's gilded halls taught the world a terrible lesson. The most sacred vow is the first to be broken for a crown. Down in the palace courtyards, another group of Huguenots who had been housed there were systematically executed. They were forced out into the open, and the soldiers butchered them under the impassive gaze of the palace windows, from which members of the court were said to be watching the spectacle. The two most important Huguenots, the newly married Henry of Navarre and his cousin, the Prince de Conde, were spared. They were not on the execution lists. They were princes of the blood, and their murder would have been a step too far, an act that would have horrified even the jaded courts of Europe. Instead, they were arrested, brought before King Charles and given a stark choice: the Mass or death. They were kept as prisoners in the Louvre, forced to watch as their friends and followers were murdered. Henry, with the pragmatism that would define his life, chose the Mass. He understood that a living apostate was more useful to his cause than a dead martyr. His conversion, made under duress, was a humiliation, but it kept him alive. He would spend the next 4 years as a gilded captive at the French court, biding his time, waiting for his chance to escape and reclaim his role as the leader of the now shattered, but soon to be reborn, Huguenot movement. His survival was one of the few accidents of fortune on a night that was otherwise characterized by meticulous, cold-blooded planning. The initial phase was a brutal success. The Huguenot leadership in Paris was effectively annihilated in the space of a few hours. It was a well-planned, coordinated military strike. But the tolling of the bell of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois did not just signal the start of a targeted assassination campaign. It acted as an alarm clock for the latent savagery of an entire city. As news of the admiral's death spread, and as the sounds of killing emanated from the Louvre, the Catholic militia of Paris, the bourgeois guards mobilized. They had been primed for this moment, their hatred stoked by years of war and weeks of incendiary preaching. Emboldened by the clear sanction of the king, for who else could order such a thing, they took to the streets. The scope of the violence was about to expand exponentially. The plan to eliminate a few dozen leaders was about to spiral out of control, transforming into a city-wide pogrom. The signal for this new popular phase was simple and chilling: a white cross chalked on the door of a known Huguenot household. It was an invitation to enter, to kill, to plunder. The night of the long knives had just begun, and the dawn would bring not relief, but an even greater horror as the organized terror of the state gave way to the anarchic fury of the mob. The white cross, the sacred symbol of Christ's sacrifice, became overnight a mark of death. As the sun rose on Sunday, the 24th of August, 1572, it revealed a city that had descended into a collective madness. The methodical killing of the Huguenot nobility had been the spark. The fury of the Parisian crowd was the explosion. The violence spilled out from the Louvre and the aristocratic quarters and engulfed the entire city. The Catholic militia, joined by thousands of ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, boatmen, artisans and their apprentices, formed armed gangs. They were men and women who, the day before, had been concerned with the price of bread and the weather. Now, armed with swords, pikes, clubs and butchers' knives, they became agents of a holy war. They surged through the streets, breaking down the doors marked with the fatal cross. The slogan, repeated like a demonic litany, was "Kill them all." It is the king's command and God's will. The carefully laid plan had unleashed something elemental and uncontrollable. What is more terrifying, a tyrant's order or the silent consent of the crowd? The scenes that unfolded defied imagination. This was not warfare, it was extermination. Neighbor turned on neighbor. A lifetime of petty grievances, of commercial rivalries and personal jealousies could now be settled with a knife, all under the respectable guise of religious piety. Debtors murdered their creditors and seized the ledgers. Distant relatives murdered families to inherit their property. The massacre became a bloody carnival, a chance to indulge in the darkest human impulses with impunity. Huguenot homes and businesses were systematically looted before being drenched in the blood of their owners. The streets became a charnel house. Gutters ran red. Piles of naked, mutilated bodies were stacked in public squares. The killers, their faces and arms smeared with gore, seemed to be in a state of ecstatic delirium. They saw themselves not as murderers, but as angels of extermination, cleansing the holy city of Paris of its heretical taint. The thin veneer of civilization, so carefully constructed over centuries, had been stripped away in a matter of hours, revealing the feral beast beneath. The River Seine, the lifeblood of Paris, became its sewer. Carts piled high with corpses rumbled through the streets and tipped their grotesque cargo into the water. The bodies of men, women, and children, many of them horrifically mutilated, floated downstream, bumping against the arches of the Pont Neuf. For days, the river was so clogged with the dead that the water turned a sickening shade of red, and the people of Paris could not bring themselves to eat the fish caught from its polluted waters. The violence was not confined to men of fighting age. Entire families were wiped out. Women were subjected to unspeakable brutalities before being killed. Pregnant women were disemboweled. Infants were snatched from their mothers' arms and their heads were dashed against stone walls. In one infamous incident, the renowned philosopher Petrus Ramus, a Huguenot scholar, was hunted down at the university, stabbed to death by professional rivals, and his body was thrown from a window, disemboweled by students, and tossed into the Seine. No one was safe. To be a Protestant, or even to be suspected of sympathy for them, was a death sentence. Fanaticism gives the mob a righteous excuse to indulge in its oldest and darkest desires, greed and blood. The authorities, who had initiated the violence, now found they were powerless to stop it. The forces they had unleashed had a momentum all their own. The city gates remained shut, trapping the victims inside. The provost of the merchants, the head of the city government, attempted to restore order, but his proclamations were ignored. The militia, which was supposed to be a force for order, was now the primary instrument of the slaughter. Some Catholic citizens, horrified by the carnage, attempted to intervene, hiding their Huguenot neighbors in their cellars and attics at immense personal risk. These acts of courage were the few pinpricks of light in an ocean of darkness. But they were the exception. For every person who chose to save a life, there were 100 who chose to take one. The killing continued, unabated, for 3 days. It only began to subside when there was almost no one left to kill and nothing left to plunder. The city was exhausted by its own savagery. The final death toll in Paris is impossible to know with certainty, but modern historians estimate that around 3,000 people were murdered. The architect of this chaos, the man who held the ultimate authority, remained cloistered in the Louvre. What, one must ask, was going through the mind of the young, tormented monarch, King Charles IX, as his capital city drowned itself in blood? This horrifying explosion of popular violence, was it the inevitable result of a direct order from the king and his councillors, or was it the spontaneous eruption of a deep-seated popular hatred that the authorities merely unleashed? Share your thoughts. Was the evil from the top down, or from the bottom up? King Charles IX was a prisoner in his own palace, besieged not by an enemy army, but by the consequences of his own weakness. In the hours leading up to the massacre, he had been a tempest of indecision, bullied and manipulated by his mother and her cabinet of murder. They had presented him with a fabricated story of a Huguenot plot, a threat so imminent and so dire that only a preemptive bloodletting could save his life and his throne. They played on his insecurities, his paranoia, and his deep-seated fear of his own inadequacy. When he finally gave his hysterical consent, "Kill them all," it was less the command of a sovereign and more the shriek of a cornered animal. But once the order was given and the blood began to flow, something within him seems to have shifted. The initial reluctance and horror curdled into a kind of manic excitement, a psychological break that would forever define his legacy. The weight of his decision was so immense that perhaps the only way his fragile mind could cope was to embrace the horror, to become not just its authorizer, but its most enthusiastic participant. The most enduring and terrible legend of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre is that of the king himself, standing on a balcony of the Louvre. Some sources say the Grand Bourbon, others a lower window, firing an arquebus down at the Huguenots fleeing for their lives across the river. Is the story true? Probably not. No reliable contemporary account confirms it, and it seems to have emerged later as a piece of anti-monarchical propaganda. But like all powerful myths, its truth is not in its factuality, but in what it reveals. It crystallizes the image of a monarchy that had not just permitted murder, but had taken up the weapon itself, transforming the king from a judge into an executioner. The image of Charles, his face contorted in a feverish madness, personally taking part in the slaughter, became the ultimate symbol of the Valois dynasty's moral collapse. A crown can either be a burden of responsibility or a mask for madness. For Charles, it became both. Whether he fired a gun or not is almost irrelevant. In the eyes of the world, and perhaps in his own tormented conscience, his hands were as deeply stained with blood as any back-alley butcher in Paris. For 2 days, as the city descended into anarchy, the official royal position was one of plausible deniability. The violence was blamed on the age-old feud between the houses of Guise and Coligny, a private war that had spiraled out of the court's control. It was a transparently thin excuse that convinced no one. The coordination, the use of the city militia, the killings inside the Louvre itself, all pointed directly back to the crown. By the morning of the 26th of August, with thousands dead and the city still reeking of slaughter, this position became untenable. Charles, accompanied by his mother and brothers, went before the Parliament of Paris, the highest court in the land, to deliver a formal address. In a stunning reversal, he claimed full responsibility for the massacre. He declared that his actions had been both necessary and just. He announced that he had uncovered a damnable conspiracy led by Admiral de Coligny to assassinate the entire royal family and seize the French throne. The mass killings, he stated, were not murder but a preemptive act of state security, an execution of traitors to prevent a coup d'état. With this speech, state-sponsored terror was officially enshrined as state policy. Murder was retroactively legalized. The Parlement, intimidated and compliant, formally praised the king for his wisdom and resolve. They ordered the admiral's memory to be posthumously put on trial, his coat of arms broken, his property confiscated. They declared the 24th of August a day of annual celebration to commemorate the deliverance of the kingdom from the Protestant plot. The king had not only confessed to the crime, he had declared it a victory and ordered a national holiday in its honor. This public justification was crucial. It sent a clear message to the rest of the country. The killings in Paris were not a mistake, not a riot that had gotten out of hand. They were the will of the king. This royal sanction was the signal for the violence to spread. What had been a Parisian horror was about to become a French catastrophe. The king had transformed himself from the protector of his people into the chief executioner of a significant portion of them. The psychological toll of this transformation would haunt him for the rest of his short, miserable life. He was now the Bloody King, a title that would follow him to his grave. And as he made his triumphant declarations, messengers were already being dispatched from the capital, their saddlebags heavy with letters and instructions, carrying the king's deadly will on fresh horses to the provinces. The messengers galloped out of the still stinking city of Paris, carrying the king's official version of events, and in many cases secret instructions for the provincial governors. The news they carried spread like a brushfire across the parched landscape of a religiously divided France. The royal declaration that the massacre had been necessary to thwart a Huguenot plot was both a justification and an implicit command. The wave of violence born in the capital now rolled across the country. The echo of the Parisian death knell would be heard in a dozen other cities, sometimes with even more savage intensity. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was not a single event, but a season of slaughter that lasted for weeks, revealing both the depths of fanaticism and the occasional, astonishing heights of human decency in the face of it. The response in each city was different, a testament to the fact that history is not just made by kings and queens, but by the choices of thousands of local magistrates, captains, bishops, and ordinary citizens. In some cities, the Parisian example was followed with gruesome enthusiasm. In Orleans, on the 26th of August, the killing began. For 3 days, Catholic mobs, often led by the city's own officials, hunted down and murdered hundreds of Huguenots. In Lyon, a major economic hub with a large Protestant population, the slaughter was delayed for several days, but when it came, it was horrific. The city's executioner refused to take part, famously stating that he was a killer of condemned criminals, not of honest citizens. His scruples were not shared by others. Militiamen and a mob of butchers and river workers took matters into their own hands, massacring hundreds and throwing their bodies into the Rhône. In Rouen, in Bordeaux, in Toulouse, similar scenes of carnage unfolded. The methods were often the same as in Paris. Gangs of killers, incited by radical preachers and sanctioned by complicit authorities, would drag Protestants from their homes and butcher them in the streets. It was a decentralized, nationwide pogrom, a chilling demonstration of how quickly a murderous idea could be replicated. Yet this was not the whole story. In the midst of this nationwide explosion of hatred, there were remarkable acts of courage and compassion. Not every governor, mayor, or bishop was willing to become a murderer on the king's command. In some regions, local leaders actively resisted the orders from Paris and saved the lives of their Protestant citizens. The governor of Provence, the Comte de Tende, flatly refused to carry out any killings. The governor of Bayonne, the Vicomte d'Orthez, is said to have written back to the king with the now famous reply, "Sire, I have communicated your Majesty's command to his faithful inhabitants and soldiers of the garrison. I have found among them good citizens and brave soldiers, but not one executioner." In Lisieux, Bishop Jacques Benin de Milon personally protected the city's Huguenots, sheltering them and preventing a massacre. These men were heroes, righteous individuals who chose conscience over conformity, risking royal displeasure and even their own lives to uphold a basic moral law. Their actions demonstrate that the massacre was not inevitable. It was a choice made differently in different places. They proved that even in the darkest of times, authority can be questioned and humanity can prevail. The stories of escape and survival from this period read like desperate thrillers. Huguenots fled into the forests and mountains, seeking refuge in the Protestant stronghold of the south. They hid in haylofts and secret cellars, aided by Catholic friends and neighbors who were appalled by the bloodshed. Families were separated in the chaos, undertaking perilous journeys to try to reach the safety of Geneva or England. The massacre created a vast wave of refugees, spreading tales of horror throughout Protestant Europe and hardening the resolve of those who remained to fight back. The violence was not a one-way street. In some towns, like Nimes, the Huguenots were in the majority and managed to defend themselves, turning the tables on their would-be killers in a counter-massacre known as the Michelade. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was not just a slaughter, it was the trigger for the Fourth War of Religion, a conflict that would be fought with a new and bitter intensity. The hope for a peaceful reconciliation so recently celebrated at a royal wedding was now utterly extinguished, replaced by a certainty that this was a war for survival. The news of these events, of the massacres and the resistance, was spreading not only through France, but across the international grapevine of merchants, diplomats and spies to the great courts of Europe. The news of the massacre crossed the English Channel and struck the court of Queen Elizabeth I like a physical blow. In Protestant Europe, the initial reaction was disbelief, which quickly gave way to horror and outrage. Elizabeth's government had been cautiously negotiating a potential marriage alliance with one of Catherine de' Medici's sons. Now such talk was impossible. When the French ambassador, La Motte-Fenelon, was granted an audience at the royal palace, he was forced to walk through a silent, funereal assembly. The Queen and her entire court were dressed in deep mourning. Elizabeth received him with an icy formality, her face a mask of cold fury, and listened to his recitation of the official French excuse, the story of the foiled Huguenot plot, with undisguised contempt. In London, preachers delivered thunderous sermons condemning the Parisian matins, and pamphlets with lurid illustrations of the killings were sold on the streets, shaping an English Protestant identity built on a deep and abiding fear of Catholic treachery. For England, the massacre was a terrifying glimpse of what could happen if their own Catholic rivals, supported by Spain, ever gained the upper hand. In Geneva, the city of John Calvin, the spiritual capital of the Huguenot movement, the response was one of profound grief and practical solidarity. The city declared a day of fasting and prayer. As thousands of desperate, blood-spattered refugees began to pour across the border, the small city-state opened its gates and its homes. These refugees brought with them first-hand accounts of the horror, stories that would be recorded and disseminated throughout the Protestant world, forming the core of what would become the Black Legend of Catherine de' Medici and the Valois dynasty. For the theologians and political thinkers in Geneva, the massacre was a paradigm-shifting event. It proved that a Catholic monarch could not be trusted, and that in the face of such tyranny, resistance was not just a right, but a sacred duty. The intellectual seeds of revolution were being sown in the fertile ground of martyrdom. The massacre had aimed to destroy the Protestant movement. Instead, it had given it a cause, an army of exiles, and a powerful new ideology of righteous rebellion. The reaction in the Catholic capitals, however, was starkly different. In Madrid, at the austere court of King Philip II of Spain, the news was received with unconcealed joy. Philip, the most powerful Catholic monarch in the world, and a man who rarely showed emotion, is said to have laughed upon hearing the details of the slaughter in Paris. It was for him a moment of profound triumph. The threat of a French Protestant alliance against his holdings in the Netherlands had been eliminated. His great rival, Admiral de Coligny, was dead, and France, his primary geopolitical competitor, had been plunged back into a self-destructive civil war, leaving him free to pursue his own ambitions. He wrote a letter of hearty congratulations to Catherine de' Medici, praising her son's holy resolve and celebrating the blow struck against heresy. For the cold realpolitik of Philip, the massacre was not a tragedy. It was a strategic masterstroke, and he saw the hand of God in it. Diplomacy is the art of expressing shock at a tragedy from which you secretly benefit. Perhaps the most enthusiastic response came from Rome itself. When Pope Gregory XIII received the news, he was ecstatic. He saw the massacre as a great victory for the Catholic Church in its struggle against the Protestant Reformation. He ordered a celebratory Te Deum, a hymn of praise, to be sung in the Basilica of St. Peter. He had a special commemorative medal struck, with his own portrait on one side, and on the other, an angel bearing a sword and a cross, advancing on a group of slain and terrified Huguenots under the inscription Huguenotorum Strages, the slaughter of the Huguenots. He declared a jubilee and commissioned the great artist Giorgio Vasari to paint a series of frescoes in the Sala Regia of the Vatican Palace, depicting the events of the massacre in heroic, triumphalist terms. These frescoes can still be seen today, a chilling testament to a time when the head of the Christian Church celebrated the mass murder of other Christians. For the papacy, this was not a crime, it was a divine judgment, the saint. Bartholomew's Day, Massacre had ripped Europe in two, creating an ideological chasm that would take centuries to bridge. And as Europe's leaders celebrated or mourned, the survivors of the slaughter had to find a way to move beyond grief. Their shock was turning into a cold, hard resolve. The time for flight was over, the time for resistance had begun. The Pope in Rome and the King in Spain saw the massacre as a victory for their cause, an act of faith and sound policy. Yet Queen Elizabeth in London saw it as an act of monstrous barbarism. When nations react to the same event with such opposite moral judgments, what does it tell us about the nature of power? Does it ultimately rest on timeless principles of right and wrong, or on the shifting sands of political interests? Tell us your view. The architects of the massacre had operated under a catastrophic delusion. They believed that by cutting off the head of the Huguenot movement, the body would wither and die. They were wrong. The slaughter of thousands did not extinguish the Protestant cause, it cauterized it, burning away the factions that had favored compromise and leaving behind a core of hardened, battle-ready survivors for whom the war was now existential. The attempt at total annihilation led not to submission but to a radical new phase of resistance. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was the cradle of the French Protestant identity, an identity forged in trauma, betrayal, and an unshakable will to survive. The victims were transformed into warriors, and their grief was hammered into the sharp edge of a sword. The immediate result was the Fourth War of Religion, which erupted almost as soon as the news from Paris reached the Huguenot strongholds in the south and west of France. This was no longer a war of aristocratic factions vying for influence at court. It was a war of popular defense, a struggle for the very right to exist. The symbol of this new, defiant spirit was the city of La Rochelle. A heavily fortified port on the Atlantic coast, La Rochelle was the de facto capital of Protestant France. It was a proud, independent city that had long guarded its privileges against royal encroachment. When the king demanded the city submit to a royal governor and a Catholic garrison after the massacre, La Rochelle refused. The result was one of the most famous sieges of the 16th century. The royal army, led by the Duke of Anjou, the king's brother and one of the massacre's chief planners, laid siege to the city in the winter of 1572. They expected a quick victory. Instead, the citizens of La Rochelle, men and women alike, mounted a heroic and desperate defense that lasted for nearly 8 months. They endured constant bombardment, starvation and disease, but they would not yield. The siege of La Rochelle became an epic of Protestant resistance, a story of defiance against impossible odds that inspired Huguenots throughout France. Ultimately, the royal army, having suffered tens of thousands of casualties from combat and sickness, was forced to lift the siege. La Rochelle had held. The phoenix had risen from the ashes. Beyond the battlefield, the massacre ignited a firestorm in the world of ideas. Protestant thinkers, many of them now exiles in Geneva, were forced to confront a terrifying new reality. A legitimate anointed king had ordered the wholesale slaughter of his own subjects. This act of supreme tyranny shattered the traditional theories of political obedience. In response, a new and radical political theory emerged, the theory of tyrannicide. Writers operating under pseudonyms known as the monocomacs or king killers began to publish explosive treatises. Works like François Hopman's Franco Gallia and the anonymous Vindiciae contra Tyrannos, a defense of liberty against tyrants, argued that a king's power was not absolute. It was based on a contract with his people. If the king violated that contract, if he broke God's law and became a tyrant, the people had not only the right but the sacred duty to resist him, to overthrow him, and, if necessary, to execute him. This was revolutionary thinking. It laid the intellectual groundwork for the Dutch Revolt, the English Civil War, and, centuries later, the American and French Revolutions. The blood of the St. Bartholomew's Day martyrs had fertilized the soil from which the modern concept of popular sovereignty would grow. The key to the future of the resistance, however, was not an idea, but a man, Henry of Navarre. For 4 years after the massacre, he remained a prisoner at the French court, a hostage forced to live the life of a Catholic courtier. He played his part brilliantly, using his charm and feigned indifference to lull his captors into a false sense of security. But all the while, he was planning, waiting, observing. In 1576, he saw his chance. During a royal hunt, he slipped away from his guards and made a dramatic escape, riding hard for the south. Once he reached Protestant territory, he publicly renounced the Catholic faith that had been forced upon him at sword point and reassumed his role as the military and political leader of the Huguenot cause. His return electrified the Protestant forces. He was not just a prince of the blood, he was a survivor of the massacre, a living symbol of defiance. The war entered a new stage, more complex and more deadly, as the struggle was no longer just about religion, but about the very future of the French monarchy. The violence that Catherine de' Medici and her sons had unleashed in 1572 was now coming back to haunt them as the kingdom descended into a chaotic, three-way civil war. The curse of the massacre was beginning to fall upon the House of Valois. The curse of the Valois was not a whispered hex from a dying victim. It was the inexorable logic of political consequence. Those who had unleashed the whirlwind of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre would be consumed by the storm. The violence they had thought to control returned to devour them, dragging their dynasty into a bloody and ignominious grave. The chain of retribution began with the chief author of the crime, King Charles IX. He never recovered from the psychological burden of the massacre. He was haunted by visions of his slaughtered subjects, his nights filled with screams that only he could hear. His health, always fragile, collapsed completely. In the spring of 1574, less than 2 years after the bloody night, he died in agony at the age of 23. The official cause was tuberculosis, but the rumors were far more lurid. It was whispered that he had died from a rare affliction that caused him to sweat blood from his pores, a divine punishment that made his inner torment manifest on his skin. His final hours were spent in the care of his Huguenot nurse, to whom he allegedly confessed, "Oh, my nurse, my dear, what blood, what murders! Oh, what evil counsel I have followed! Oh, Lord God, forgive me them and have mercy upon me." The bloody king died a bloody death, leaving a throne tainted by his crime. The crown passed to his brother, the Duke of Anjou, who returned from his brief and unhappy reign as King of Poland to become King Henry III of France. Henry was intelligent, cultured, and personally brave, but he inherited a kingdom that was ungovernable, a nation torn apart by hatreds he himself had helped to inflame. He found himself trapped in a new and even more vicious conflict, the War of the Three Henrys. He was King Henry III, fighting against Henry of Navarre, leader of the Huguenots, and Henry, Duc de Guise, the charismatic and immensely popular leader of the fanatical Catholic League, which was funded by Spain and saw the king as too moderate. The Duc de Guise, the man who had personally overseen the murder of Admiral Coligny, now used his popularity to challenge the king himself, effectively ruling Paris and treating the monarch with open contempt. The king, who had helped plot a treacherous assassination in 1572, now found himself the target of similar plots. Feeling his power slipping away, Henry III decided to employ the same methods he had learned at his mother's side. In December of 1588, he lured Henry de Guise and his brother, the Cardinal de Guise, to a meeting at the Château de Blois. It was a trap. As the Duc de Guise entered the king's antechamber, he was set upon by the king's personal bodyguards, the 45, and stabbed to death. The king is said to have emerged from his chamber, looked down at the body of his towering rival, and remarked, "My God, he is even taller in death than he was in life." The next day, he had the cardinal murdered as well. The student had learned the lesson of St. Bartholomew's well. Assassination was the ultimate tool of statecraft. But the violence, once again, did not end where he intended. The murder of the de Guise brothers, who were seen as Catholic martyrs, caused Paris and the Catholic League to erupt in open rebellion against the crown. The king was forced to flee his own capital and, in a final desperate irony, to ally himself with the Protestant Henry of Navarre, the man he had helped to hold captive during the massacre. Those who sow the wind of political murder will reap the whirlwind of their own destruction. The final act of the Valois tragedy was swift and brutal. In August of 1589, while laying siege to rebel Paris with Henry of Navarre, King Henry III was visited by a young, fanatical Dominican friar named Jacques Clément. The monk claimed to have an urgent secret message for the king. As he leaned in to whisper in the king's ear, he plunged a dagger deep into his abdomen. The king died the next day. The regicide had been brainwashed by the Catholic League, who taught him that killing the tyrant king was a holy act. The very arguments of tyrannicide that the Protestants had developed in response to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre were now used by Catholics to murder the last Valois king. The curse had come full circle. Before he died, Henry III officially named his cousin and ally, the Protestant Henry of Navarre, as his heir to the French throne. The great matriarch of the doomed dynasty, Catherine de' Medici, had died a few months earlier, just before the murder of the Duc de Guise, seeing her life's work in ruins, her sons dead or dying, and the kingdom she had fought so hard to preserve collapsing into chaos. With the death of her last son, the House of Valois, which had ruled France for over 2.5 centuries, was extinct. The throne of France now legally belonged to the very man who had only survived the bloody wedding of 1572 by a twist of fate, Henry of Navarre. By the supreme and bloody irony of history, the man who was to heal France was the Huguenot prince who had narrowly escaped becoming the most prestigious victim of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Henry of Navarre, now legally Henry IV of France, inherited not a kingdom but a battlefield. The Catholic League, backed by Spain, refused to recognize a heretic king, and the wars raged on. Henry, a brilliant general, won battle after battle, but he knew that he could never truly win the peace as a Protestant. The vast majority of his subjects were Catholic, and Paris, the heart of the kingdom, would never accept him. So in 1593, he made the ultimate pragmatic sacrifice. He once again renounced his Protestant faith and converted to Catholicism, reputedly declaring with a world-weary sigh, "Paris is well worth a mass." This act of political genius broke the back of the Catholic League's resistance. The common people, exhausted by decades of war, were willing to accept a king who would bring them peace, regardless of his past. In 1594, Henry IV finally entered Paris, not as a conqueror, but as the legitimate and accepted king of a united France. His greatest act was yet to come. Having secured his throne, Henry did not forget the cause for which he had fought for so long. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes. This landmark decree was not a declaration of universal human rights, but a pragmatic and revolutionary piece of legislation for its time. It granted the Huguenots substantial rights in a nation that was still considered officially Catholic. They were granted freedom of conscience throughout the kingdom, freedom to worship publicly in specified areas, and full civil rights, including access to all public offices. Crucially, they were also allowed to maintain their own fortified towns and cities as a guarantee of their safety. The Edict of Nantes was the formal end of the French wars of religion. It was a victory not for one faith over the other, but for the idea that a state could tolerate religious diversity, that citizens who prayed differently could still be loyal Frenchmen. It was a lesson born directly out of the horror of St. Bartholomew's Day, a peace treaty written in the shadow of a massacre. The tragedy had, in the end, become the foundation for a new idea of tolerance, an idea born in agony. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre left a permanent scar on the heart of the French nation. It became a symbol of the ultimate horror of religious fanaticism and the treachery of kings. For centuries, it served as a cautionary tale, a founding trauma that shaped France's political development. The memory of a king ordering the slaughter of his own people fueled a deep-seated distrust of absolute monarchy and religious intolerance that would eventually explode in the French Revolution of 1789. The revolutionary ideal of laicite, the strict secularism of the French state, has its deepest roots in the bloody soil of 1572. It is a national commitment to ensuring that the altar and the throne can never again conspire to drench the nation in blood. The massacre remains an eternal warning about the profound danger of dehumanizing an opponent. Once a group of people is labeled as impure, as a disease, as a threat to the nation's soul, the path to the abattoir is terrifyingly short. The lessons of that bloody night are as relevant today as they were over 4 centuries ago. They speak to the fragility of peace and the ease with which societies can be whipped into a frenzy of hatred by cynical leaders who use fear as a political tool. The massacre demonstrates that the greatest atrocities are often committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people who have been convinced that their violence is righteous. It shows how personal greed and ambition can hide behind the noble mask of ideology. The men who planned the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Catherine de' Medici, the Duke of Anjou, the Guises, were not madmen. They were intelligent, calculating politicians who believed they were acting in the best interests of the state. They thought they were performing a necessary surgery to remove a cancerous tumor. But their cure was infinitely more destructive than the disease. They unleashed a plague of violence that consumed them, their family, and their kingdom. The story of St. Bartholomew's Night is a timeless and terrible reminder that the road to hell is often paved with what its architects perceive as good intentions. The architects of the slaughter believed they were saving France. They chose to impose a brutal, violent order, convinced it was the only way to avert the chaos of heresy and rebellion. They believed their ends justified their means, but where is the line between the necessary defense of a nation and the unforgivable crime of state terrorism? Look at our world now, a world still torn between these same impulses. What path do you believe truly leads to a better future, a rigid order, even if it is built on the suppression of dissent and the blood of those deemed dangerous, or a messy, unpredictable freedom with all its inherent risks of conflict and chaos? There is no simple answer, but your choice defines the world you wish to live in. Let us know in the comments which path you would choose for us all.